David. Yeah, I always get a kick out of rooms like this. It's very humbling. Has anybody else looked out the window? Have you tried to count all the windows? And then have you thought about how many of the products you ship are behind those windows? I think I can see about 5 million Android users from these windows. And it's terrifying, frankly. It's really humbling to have been given the opportunity to work on something that at this point has become fundamental to the way that people interact with the world, right? When we think about Android security, you think about things like Square, right? You think about financial transactions. You think about the fact that you can hail an anonymous person to drive a car with you in it to another place, and somehow you became comfortable with that based on security properties that were innate in mobile platforms that you're now using. You might think about other things as well. When I joined Android about 6 years ago, there was a member of my team who said, "I will know we've succeeded when Obama is using an Android device." And in June of this year, we started to hear rumors that that might be true. I don't know if it's true, so I can't answer those rumors, but we certainly saw him begin to talk as though he'd been making a transition off of the previous device that he'd been using. And how many other world leaders are using it? Like, what are the risks that they are being exposed to? I tend to think of a different set of people and have a sort of kinship with those people. I think of the people who can afford $15 or 15 pounds, depending on exchange rate at the time, and can buy the cheapest device available to them. And what they almost universally end up purchasing is either an old Nokia or an Android device. And this is the lifeline that they have that establishes their connection to the world when they decide to flee from a state that has persecuted them or has prevented them from being successful, right? So Android is, in many cases, the foundation of their connection to the world. And for me, thinking about security, what's really, really intriguing about that is some of the costs that we have associated with security have previously made security something that was prohibitive, right? World leaders could get a secure device, but that was going to be something profoundly different from what it was that was available to an average person, much less someone who only has a single device and the clothes on their back. But at this point, devices have evolved to the point where they're basically using the same technology stack. Alex spoke earlier when he was talking about bug bounties, about at the extreme edge of the bug bounties are these platforms that cost $100,000 to break into them, right? Chrome OS was the one that he listed, and then he mentioned Android and iOS, right? What I think of as the mobile platforms share a common set of properties, right? They have, from the very beginning, thought about security and thought about making it available in a uniform way to all people. And so if I go back 35 years ago to the Orange Book in the United States and defining what the security properties of a good device would look like, at this point, we've basically accomplished those things for mobile devices. We've basically gotten into the area of rounding as the types of mistakes that we're seeing, right? The FBI honestly wasn't sure whether they could get into that device. I believe that, having had lots of conversations with them after the fact about whether they'd be able to get into other Android devices. In the same way, they're seriously considering making changes to the law to facilitate access, right? The basic security properties of these devices available to an average person, or even a below average person in many cases, have gotten to be that good. And yet, we still keep worrying about a future in which there's going to be all of these security risks. I think the talks earlier today described something that was really interesting, right? It's a shift away from purely technical security into personal security. It's a need to have diversity in your ecosystem so you don't have sort of catastrophic failure across the entire ecosystem, is one of the things that Sadie mentioned. A number of these properties that I think are really, really have not previously been incorporated into platforms and have previously not been something that platform providers worried about. Mustafa, I thought, really nicely highlighted that the strategies that are employed and the incentives that exist for the various people that exist in an ecosystem in the past have been a little bit strange, right? There was never an incentive for platform providers to really provide the best possible security in our legacy operating systems, because there was bolt-on security provided and an ecosystem of security providers that were there. But the new mobile platforms, the platform providers have taken a very, very different approach. And that's true for all of them that are being successful right now. So I think that's sort of the grounding of what we have for mobile operating systems right now, regardless of which platform you look at. But there are some things that we're doing on Android that are, I think, somewhat unique. And these harken back to David and is talking about machine learning and the ability to do analysis on data and how we can use that to make our systems more and more adaptive. I think that's going to be especially important when the types of attacks we see are within the security model, right? They're social engineering, they're phishing, they're those types of manipulations, and how do you react to those? So there's something that we've been doing kind of behind the scenes. We call it Android Safety Net. It's not really got branding on it because it's something that's sort of buried deep within our applications. But the Google applications, which are on most of those 1.4, or sometimes it's 1.7, our numbers grow about as fast as the phishing I just got pwned website, right? The numbers in terms of Android users go up about as fast as that. So I think we're at about 1.7 to 1.8 billion right now. So in those devices is something that we call Safety Net. How does it work? Basically, it checks the security status on devices on a fairly regular basis. For any device that's being in active use, it's probably at least once a week. I think our cycle is about 6 days. We try to have it not on a weekly cycle so that our noise gets canceled out. It's got some random variants in there. And then we do some interesting things, like in Russia, we scan every day. And the reason we scan every day in Russia is simply because the level of abuse in Russia was so high about a year ago that scanning every day gives us the opportunity to drive that number down. And we've talked about that publicly sometimes previously. But the point being that we're bringing in this data, analyzing it, and then trying to understand what adaptation we can introduce into the system. Some of it's going to be structural, right? We'll add new features at the platform level. Some of it's going to be configuration. We will change a setting in order to have the behavior be somewhat different. My hope is eventually the system actually gets to the point where it's reactive, right? So that warning that you get when you go to log in on a Google site that says you're traveling right now, that's because we've begun to realize that passwords get stolen. And so you need to have a risk system that's based around that. My belief is at a platform level, that's what needs to be everywhere, right? Is a calculation of risk associated with the characteristics of the event that's about to happen. And so Safety Net is a beginning of moving in that direction, of having context associated with platform level security decisions. So how do we do that? We consume the data, we analyze it. It comes in lots of different forms, right? This is sort of a basic flow for how it is that we look at an application and try to evaluate whether it's one that you might want to install or not. Before you install an application from Google Play, for example, this whole analysis has already been done. It's probably been done a lot of times because we do it before the app is available to anybody, and then we continue to review the data, continue to aggregate new information as we learn more about the developer, as we learn more about the application, as new applications are introduced into the system and we can establish relationships between those different applications. As new entities into the system, we can establish those relationships between them. So the goal is to really understand everything we can about the application so that we can inform the user about whether or not it's something that would be appropriate for them to install into their device. So we do that in Google Play, and then we also make it available through Safety Net for warning about applications that you might have got from some other place out there on the internet, right? Because ultimately, our belief is you need to be able to get applications from anywhere. Openness is a fundamental premise for how it is that Android works, and really how it is that Google thinks about the way that the world should work. But at the same time, we want to have a layer of safety on top of it. And so we try to analyze that and make that available as well. Now, then the question is, so you've got good understanding, how do you turn that into actual action? And this is sort of the network view of interactions that involve our security services. I use the word woven up at the top, and I think that's a good way to think about it, right? There's lots of these different interactions. Some of them are directly with Google services, right? So you go to Google Play, the applications you get, you can be assured that they've already gone through that kind of review process. You might go to install that application. It's the newest version of Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go wants to know whether it's running on a legitimate device or one that's been modified to send false location data, harkening to the talk we had just a minute ago, so that you can get the new kerfluffle. I have not been playing recently for a variety of reasons, not least of which is my phone is a beta, and so I failed the integrity checks. So I can't play Pokemon Go. So my wife is pretty upset. So is our 6-year-old. But we're working on it. The point being, applications are being provided the ability to do these kinds of intelligent analyses of the security model of the device that they're on based on Google's understanding of it. So we're making those available as services so that they can be pulled in at the application level. So it's not just about, is a security application worried about security, but it's also basic consumer services and games and those types of risks that are associated with abuse at that kind of level. And then, of course, there's tying it into email, tying it into the other services that Google provides as well. So the idea is that these services can be combined with security in a way that's non-intrusive, that raises the level of security associated with the user, and they don't even realize that this is happening, right? And this is part of how these mobile platforms have become more secure. So they've incorporated security sort of transparently into the set of services that they have. Apple, I think, has done a spectacular job of describing how they do that with their App Store. People fundamentally believe the App Store is safe because of the success they've had in explaining how it is that they've provided these processes. We have not been quite as successful in explaining that. One of the reasons is because we've embraced bringing the security community onto the Android platform where they're able to be introspective and they're able to find bad things. The approach that we've been taking is to make data available so you are able to put this risks associated with the platform into perspective, right? So this is a graph of the frequency with which PHAs are found on an Android device out there in the wild. PHA stands for potentially harmful application. Think of it as a superset of malware inclusive of some of the other types of behaviors that are not quite at the level that you would actually consider them to be malicious, right? So it's not uncommon for sort of mid-tier application to accidentally cross the line and gather a little bit too much data, and we'll classify it as PHA. The yellow line is the frequency with which a user who's got a device that's only installing from Google Play has encountered a PHA, or we found a known PHA on their device. That number is running around 0.07%, right? So 7 out of every 1,000 devices, relatively low number. An order of magnitude higher at about 0.5% are sort of the average across the ecosystem, and then about a multiple of 2 of that are just the people who are installing a significant number of applications from outside of Google Play. They're right around 1%. Now, those numbers, they sound pretty good, but then you put them in the context of this is worldwide, right? Includes Russia, includes India, a number of other countries that are notorious for having a significant variation from the median. In addition to that, these are unmanaged devices, or at least they're managed only by a platform provider, right? Google is providing the security service to these devices. If you compare these numbers to the frequency with which malware is found on corporate managed desktop computers, it's another order of magnitude, right? It's not even going to be on this slide. You're into the 5 to 10% of those devices when you do a system-wide scan have things that are on them. And those are locked down devices. So a very significant difference, and you begin to see the sort of effects of having these systems in place has had in terms of the hygiene of the overall ecosystem. Now, that's a little bit inconsistent with what you might have heard. And so I want to sort of directly talk a little bit about what we've been seeing with the media. It's been very, very fascinating for me. My background is on exploitation. I came from the offensive side a long time ago. Then I was at Stake doing consulting. And I was expecting, based on my experience that when I came to mobile operating systems, well, 2 things. One, it was a just clean slate, so we could start again. That was great. And I was expecting we were going to have a ton of work to do because what I'd been hearing was so pessimistic. But what we've been hearing is about risk, right? About fear. Which is very, very different from what I had been seeing 15 years earlier on desktop operating systems. And even today, what we're seeing on legacy server operating systems or modern server operating systems, where it's not a risk of your data center being compromised and all your data being leaked, it's a reality of your data center. So what do we see on Android, right? I picked a couple of fairly prominent names of vulnerabilities that we've seen over the last 3-4 years. My standard here is, did it run as a major article in the BBC? And these are some of the headlines. Those are not actually directly pulled from the BBC. They're from other places as well. But that's the way the risk is characterized. And then there's the reality of when we go back and look at data, because SafetyNet gives us the ability to have very good visibility into several of these, we really don't see a significant amount of exploitation. The one that we've seen the most exploitation for of these 3 was Fake ID, and that's in the sort of same level of risk categorization that you would see for whether a human's going to get struck by lightning. Now, I look out the window, 1 in a million means 5 or 6 people are having that happen to them today. It's not great. I'd love to have it be 1, 2, 0. But it is very significantly different from the level of risk they're associated with in just every other element of their life. It's not unique to Android. It was really, really interesting about 2 months ago to see, I don't know if people remember Pegasus Trident, some work done by Citizen Lab. And then eventually by Lookout analyzing what at the time was reported as the first instance of malware being installed through jailbreaking onto a set of dissidents, basically, devices. The response to that was amazing. Huge, huge response. Unprecedented, oh my gosh, I'm afraid. And we've seen the same thing with Android vulnerabilities as well. Like IT says, turn off all the devices. You're like, wait, what about the 50,000 other devices that you've got that are connected that don't have the same level of security protection? So I think something that we're thinking about is how is that going to evolve over time and what do those changes look like? So when I think about sort of the future and the change, we've already seen sort of a step function from what I think of as legacy operating systems to the more general mobile operating systems. Exploitation at the moment had to be more significant in order to accomplish the same goals because we have a much more locked down security model. We don't actually see very much exploitation. And overall, the level of risk associated with the devices has gone down. And I think over the coming years, we're going to see that continue to go down. Because I think this is really a level set where we've changed fundamentally how we're thinking about security. The platform provider is making a best effort to actually provide all of the elements of the security stack. We're learning from our previous experience, and we're not burdened by what is 20 to 30 years of legacy in terms of the technological stack. So I'm actually pretty excited about it. It doesn't make me feel that much better when I look out the window, knowing, but it does give me some hope because there's a lot of people out there that we're working sort of collectively to give them those types of protections. So that's what I wanted to talk about.
So Adrian, you've heard from lots of people who've been in lots of geographies, who've heard from lots of victims of crime, some of the risk factors out there. What is it that most worries you as threats?
So I think they're practical threats, right? Stolen phone is still like a practical threat, and it's probably one of the most significant threats that an average person can face, right? Like, that's very fundamental, right? Hit you in the face, take your device because the device has value. And those never really go away. I think one of the things that we tend to lose sight of is, malware on PCs, it's like, it's just happening. And we got bored with it. And so it continues to be like the most significant risk. You click on a link and you get owned. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of those sort of day-to-day sort of boring types of issues. Pragmatically though, I think if I were to worry about 10 years from now, I think we have some structural problems with the way the industry, and by that I mean sort of computing and IT is structured in general. I think too much of security investment is tied to marketing. And I think that's very, very problematic. I think at the same time, too much of our investment is based on reacting to security as opposed to predicting issues. And I think cost models for very low value devices simply don't support having that kind of a cost infrastructure, right? We've done some analyses on what it costs to patch an Android device. And it ends up being as significant as the hardware when you get down into low-end devices. And so when you talk about an Internet of Things, sort of device that's in the 50 cents to $1, you're talking if I need to patch that over a 5-year or 10-year life cycle, I can't do that and sell it. Like I have to choose one of those two things.
I guess
so I think there's some structural problems.
There's also a tension between usability of the product and protecting vulnerability. My Google Pixel allows me to log in by touching with my fingerprint. I presume that is not a highly secure biometric way to log in.
I think I honestly am not convinced that the tension between usability and security is a long-term problem. There was an earlier presentation where there was a picture of a card, right? And it said, obviously this is a user fail. I'm like, okay, but who decided to put the number as a permanent thing to last for 7 years? So if you ever had somebody take a picture of it, it's compromised. Like that's a technical problem in the way that we created those that created a usability challenge. And I think as we've gone through, one by one, a lot of the usability conflicts are ones that if you think a little bit harder, you can find a way past them. Part of that's about having more context and more flexibility and sort of really thinking through what the user experience is going to look like. So I'm not sure that actually is going to end up being one of the long-term problems that we face.
Thank you very much for making the journey and for telling the Android story. Thanks. Adrian, thank you.